Hi, everyone. I'm Stephen Evans, Executive Director of FotoFest, and I want to welcome you to another of our Creative Conversations programs. We're really excited about the program today, and I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. As we begin, I'd like to thank our supporters for making these programs possible and making the exhibition that they're related to possible. You see one of the images from the exhibition behind me here on the screen, and it's called Public Life. And major funding for FotoFest Public Life programs is provided by the Texas Commission on the Arts. We could not have made this project without them. And program support for the project is also provided by the Brown Foundation, Inc., the Houston Endowment, the National Endowment for the Arts, the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance, the Wortham Foundation, Silver Street Studios, Sawyer Yards, Papa's Restaurants, Lovett Commercial, and generous donors to the FotoFest Annual Fund. And for their major institutional and individual support, I'd also like to thank the Philip and Edith Leonian Foundation, the Powell Foundation, the WWW Foundation, the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation, Judith and Gamble Baldwin, Wendy Watrous and Frederick Baldwin, our co-founders, Katie and Michael A. Casey, Martha and David Moore, Nina and Michael Zilka, the FotoFest Board of Directors, and Island Cloud Services. And then lastly, I'd like to thank the FotoFest Manager of Engagement and Communications, Brandon Harris, for his technical and logistical support of the program today, and also making sure that people know about it. The focus of the program today will be a dialogue between the Cultural Research Collective Urban Subjects and FotoFest Associate Curator and Director of Publishing Max Fields. Urban Subjects was formed in 2004 by Sabine Bitter, Jeff Derksen, and Helmut Weber, and they are based in Vancouver, Canada, and Vienna, Austria. Together, they develop artistic poetic projects focusing on global urban issues, the texture of cities, and on civic imaginations. They've held residencies at the VIVO Media Arts Center in Vancouver, at the Lufana Arts Program in Lüneburg, and at the Austrian Pavilion Expo in Milano. Their publications include Autogestion or Henley Lefebvre in New Belgrade, Momentarily, Learning from Mega Events, and as guest editors, Camera Austria number 139, which was an issue on sincerity. They've also curated exhibitions internationally, such as Not Sheep, New Urban Enclosures and Commons, which was presented at ArtSpeak, Vancouver, The Militant Image, Picturing What is Already Going On, or The Poetics of the Militant Image, for the Camera Austria presentation at the 2014 festival Sterischer Herbst in Graz. Excuse my pronunciation if I stumbled. And they facilitated the exhibition and public programming for the Vienna Model Housing for the 21st Century at the Museum of Vancouver in 2017. In 2019, they curated the exhibition It's Never Too Late to Speculate at Fluch, Vienna. Also, they've realized an installation and magazine publication entitled We Hope This Does Not Make Us Sad, Architecture and Design in the Plutocratic Age, as part of Halfway, a research project by Christian Tucker, Christina Nagel, and Heidi Pretterhofer on spatializing urban conditions. Yeah, and that was in Vienna, Austria as well. So they've been busy. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Urban Subjects and to introduce this talk with our Associate Curator, Max Fields. Please come in the room.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And thank you so much, Urban Subjects, for joining us. I'm so thrilled to be in conversation with you, and I'm glad that Stephen kind of went through the roster of many of your exhibitions so people can hear about, yes, you have been extremely busy for a long time. And just so people have a bit more context than just your bio, I'm curious if, before we begin, Could you introduce yourself to the audience so that they can understand the context from which we're taking off for this conversation? Who is Urban Subjects? When were you formed? Why? And how do you all work together?
Maybe I start with a personal note. And that is, I wanted to mention, when I was an art student in the 80s in Linz, Austria, there was no photography department in all over Austria, not at any university. So the institution Camera Austria in Graz was kind of taking a place of that because they had all this like discursive photo symposia with LCQ, all of these things. It was really great. And the former director, Christine Fresingelli, always talked about the global network of photography as art. And since the mid 80s, I know about the FotoFest in Houston. And I've never been there, but I was just wanted to say I was really excited to get an invitation after knowing about you guys for such a long time.
Yeah, thank you.
How much do you want to start?
Yeah, I'm Helmut Weber, and I'm a visual artist and mainly working in Vienna. But since the mid-90s, Sabine and I am collaborating. And since, as you mentioned before, since 2004, I'm also part of the collective Urban Subjects.
So out of our collaboration, I'm Sabine, I'm also teaching, I'm working with Helmut, and I'm also teaching in Vancouver in the visual art area. And when was it? 1998, Helmut and I went to an artist residency in Banff. And that's when we met Jeff Derksen. And soon we started to collaborate on urban subjects.
Actually live and collaborate together. So it is quite the collapse of art and life is something that we've kind of completed in many senses. So yeah, hi, I'm Jeff Derksen. I grew up near Vancouver in Canada, and I work at Simon Fraser University, which ironically I grew up very close to. And I hadn't intended on going back home to Vancouver once I'd moved to Vienna, but this great job on position in globalization and cultural theory opened up, so I moved there. I'd mostly been working as a poet previously, so publishing books of poetry, but just really being involved in kind of global network of poets. And also we're very deeply in dialogue with visual artists, and that's something that Vancouver had a particular history and a really great context for. So, and I kind of grew up artistically in a sense with no separation between poetry and language and art and visual artists. So for me, moving and getting into a collaborative situation with Helmut and Sabine was something that I was already kind of prepped for by the kind of communities that I've been involved with earlier.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. Talking about a collapse of space and time, that'll be the subject of most of our conversation today. So I think that's a funny way to begin. But maybe to provide a bit of context about how we began talking together, our first experience, our first discussion was talking about a shared, somewhat shared pandemic experience, right? Feeling that time was simultaneously moving at a snail's pace and lightning speed. And the snail's pace was due to this, living at work, working from home, brought on by the pandemic crisis and lockdown. And then this lightning speed mode of temporality based on the inundation of news media headlines that were, influencing our daily lives. I'd like to ask if you could reflect on your experience as artists living and working throughout the pandemic years, and to ask you how this pandemic time has influenced your work and thinking.
Yeah, maybe starting from a very obvious point of view, but the most striking effect of the pandemic was that we could not travel anymore. So it was not possible to move back and forth between the two workplaces we have, between Vancouver and Vienna. And then this kind of constraint situation even extended, because then it was not possible to visit and work at places where we have exhibition had been planned or projects should have been continued. So exhibition got delayed, cancelled, or most of the time they got rescheduled. So this stress of place and time, it became really stressful in terms of time and space again.
And then, the other thing that we experienced, I think, was, as Helmut's pointing out, the kind of first spatial aspect of the COVID shutdown. No travel, and especially for people who work on place-based research, that of course made quite a difference to us. And so when we had that collapse too, of, as you did, Max, I know, like working from home, and Sabine and I working at universities, big institutions, moving everybody to home offices and that. I think that the experience that folks had of the COVID was kind of first spatial, so there's disruption to home. Some of that can be very positive, like for me, the lack of a commute was something I appreciated. But then later, I think the experience of the COVID extended moment was one that became temporal. You start to realize that you were working under a different time regime or a different temporality. So through that collapse of your workspace and your domestic space, you're also having the collapse of your domestic time and your kind of work time. In fact, most people, I think, found that work time expanded and they're working longer hours. I think there's just been sociological studies that show that, and particularly for frontline workers, they were under a very different time regime than what they'd previously worked on. So suddenly we discovered we're working under a new kind of clock, in a sense. And we also discovered, I think, that time and temporality could be radically retooled quite quickly, right? So for the necessity of COVID, we suddenly were working under and living under different temporal conditions. I think too, that collapse of space and time together showed how entwined time and space are. And so we started to think a little more through the framework of time and think a little more temporally, since we've been predominantly working through questions of space. One of the people that we were researching and actually we're doing a podcast with in a month or so, Sarah Sharma, has a nice quote from her book called In the Meantime, which I'll recommend as a nice vigorous read on temporality. But she says that the social fabric is composed of a chronography of power, where individuals and social groups' senses of times and possibilities are shaped by a differential economy, limited or expanded by the ways and means which they find themselves in and out of time. So just that relationship between time and labor, and time as something that's lived socially rather than time as something that's given historically or lived abstractly.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that when we talked, we all shared this this experience of talking to people from all around the globe, and I definitely, for the first time in my life, hearing almost the exact same response, whether I was talking to somebody in Vancouver, Austria, Brazil, or China. How are you doing? And how are you? Was responded to with I'm exhausted, I'm bored, I'm also overworked and underworked and confused. And yeah, it was such an incredible shock. And I think that for the first time, people were really globally like sharing a moment or several moments in a lot of ways. You know, between if we're thinking about how people worked, you know, as you mentioned, essential laborers, you know, essential laborers had a bonding over that kind of shared experience, and then those who were not as fortunate to have work, or I mean, depending on how you look at it, we're also feeling that kind of temporal pressure and collapse of space. I I know you were already thinking about time. I mean, it's a huge part of a component of your work, but maybe it makes sense to talk about your most recent exhibition, curated exhibition at Camera Austria, your project If Time is Still Alive. Can you talk about your thinking around time and space in relation to this exhibition, and maybe share a few images from this project so that people can get an understanding of how this project came together, how it was, influenced by these past couple of years.
Yeah, actually, the exhibition project was part of a larger collaborative project. It was called The City and the Good Life, and it was initiated by Camera Austria Graz in Austria, and it was planned to be realized in 2020. But finally, it ended in May this year. So, and the project was framed by a focus on communities and somehow on a bias towards communal spaces and towards new ideas of notions of public space. But already in the beginning, we decided to put an emphasis, not knowing about the impact of the pandemic, to put an emphasis on the notion of time, but always related to space. And somehow the central question was, what is public time?
There was a symposium actually planned with the title "The Public Image," which has also a history with Camera Austria, but all of that got cancelled because of COVID. Right. It was unfortunate.
So with that emphasis on public image and our previous work on space and public space, we just decided to make the shift towards public time, to investigate public time. I'll also say that part of the reason that we made a shift to thinking temporally was that we were noticing that there had been kind of a proliferation of different temporalities arising. So there is, particularly in North America, the notion of indigenous time or indigenous temporalities. Afrofuturism is something that was kind of growing and becoming more exciting. There's also notions of revolutionary time, particularly around the rise of social movements since essentially for this century. But then just other notions of time and ways of being together, like comrade time, public time, these kinds of things we wanted to investigate. So it seemed very organic to make the leap from public space to public time. But then we found out there actually hadn't been a lot of research on public time and its concept. Lots of research on concepts of time, but public time was one that seemed to be negated a little bit or underexposed. So we started doing that research. There was some sociological research from the 70s where public time was noted. There was some artistic research from around the turn of the century. So we did notice that there was an out of balance between research in the arts on public space and on the notion of public time. Even though we have so many artworks that, of course, work that are durational or even have time as the theme or content that they're looking at. And of course, over the last couple of centuries, since the notion of the avant-garde and as a kind of speeding up, notions of time have been very central to artistic projects as well. So we wanted to do a show in a sense that filled some of those gaps, but that essentially looked to materialize time, to make time more material and open it as a site of investigation itself. We wanted to propose a show too that introduced people to alternative temporalities.
So these are a few installation shots, and we basically asked 5 artists who already worked with alternative ideas of time or temporality, or where time is already a subject of their work. As an exhibition to create a different also time schedule when people visit an exhibition. We have these lounging areas covered with fabric where people were really invited to spend time lounge there and watch the works either sitting down or laying down in a very comfortable way. And even the works on the wall were also hang lower so that you can really experience them better in sitting, or also it could be also in a wheelchair, but we changed the spatial and the temporal setting as an exhibition design. This one, as you have seen this fabric, that was actually a work by Urban Subject as a kind of infrastructure for the exhibition. And that tied together on one hand our research into the history of time, but also how it emerges from like time. How did we say? We talked about time as a social construction and how that emerged through history. So we produced this curtain fabric.
Helmut and Sabine had previously done a few textile works, which you'll see a bit later, but just in reading about textiles and actually visiting some historic sites in Austria and Haslach, through the kind of artistic research we were doing, I found that the hour emerged as a unit of labor within the textile industry, within the weaving industry. So we wanted to do something that brought those two things together. How do you materialize time within a form of labor that an hour was actually born in a sense?
Right. So working on the loom, that was the time, on the weaving factories was when the time, the 1 hour as a unit was kind of defined. And then we used the scan of the original in Karl Marx, Das Kapital, which says at the end of 1 hour spinning, that act is represented by a definite quantity of yarn. In other words, a definite quantity of yarn of labor, namely that of 1 hour, has been embodied in the cotton. So we use that as a positive and negative jacquard weaving, and every 3.6 meters there is a line which actually marks the 1 hour weaving of that cotton. So we talked about it in a way as a textile that embodies the actual labor time of its production, while at the same time it makes it visible, the temporality of the labor process.
Yeah, I think this work in particular is such a good representation of your practice, because it brings together historical research surrounding material histories, but also theoretical histories, and it puts the mechanism behind the production in conversation with aesthetics, with contemporary social, cultural, and political conditions, and creates an experience out of it. And I think it's one of my favorite aspects of this exhibition is the way in which you use them as these fabrics as a motif to actually connect with the person. A person literally can sit and live on for a moment this material and see themselves in it or on it in this case.
The aesthetic of it actually is a very everyday object in Austria. It's very much just a normal dishcloth, or it could be a tabletop. So for people visiting the show in Austria, they would just see an everyday object that was, in a sense, had been aestheticized, but also an everyday object in which the material labor had been, the temporal material labor had been made visible in the production of it.
And counters also the idea of industrial labor, paid labor, to not paid labor of household and of caretaking and of female labor.
Absolutely.
Reproductive labor.
Right, and like as a final note, it was really quite fantastic to see how it's possible that this kind of high resolution scan from the original page of the Capitol got somehow translated and transformed and reworked into being a part of this everyday, almost everyday life fabric, what we are used to just in the kitchen.
Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about the other artists featured in the exhibition?
Yeah, on the what you see on the wall on the back side is a collage of text of images by the Austrian artist Eckermann.
And she basically, as her practice, she makes a magazine, which is called, these are all parts of enlarged things of a magazine. The magazine is called Crip Magazine. And she works on the experience of non-normative bodies, I think she says, within a regime of ability. So she, from a theoretical and aesthetic practical practice, puts together, edits and writes and makes drawings and photographs through these magazines. They all point to an experience of non-normative bodies. And I think she also talked about the non-normativity by Friedman and chrononormativity, right? Right.
So yeah, essentially her work centers on how non-conforming bodies have to try and conform to these temporal regimes. Often we might think of non-conforming bodies as always having to deal with space, but her work has been central in pointing out that temporal aspect.
I think what's interesting is, despite like a lay person's like familiarity with a term like chrononormativity, over the past couple of years, the term has been normalization of time and space, and also politics, right? People will say, let's get back to normal. And this is an example of an artist who is thinking about how the term normal and the sort of behaviors that are contained within that term are actually bordered and restrictive. And I think it's quite interesting that you brought in this moment, like an example of somebody who's been working on, or an example of an artist who's been thinking about normativity and a response to it, a pushing against it in this context. It's an interesting way of reading. It's an interesting way of reading art as a curator, to bring in an artist like this, to qualify them in this context.
Right. And another group we invited, that was a commissioned work, is by the School of Temporality, German artist Annette Kaus, Maya Bekamp from Belgrade, and Viennese artist Julia Wieger. They worked with women in Graz and interviewed them about the idea of public time. So that was, of course, through the pandemic, also a little bit different, but then they produced this, I think, beautifully made posters, and also they made a magazine from it. This is from a tram driver, so it was all about women and how working through the pandemic changed their notion of time. So the tram driver talks about that it was kind of funny, a bit like a horror movie when there are only vehicles with driver cabs and nobody in it, so they drive alone. And a kid, a pupil, about Corona public time, that it's when I'm wearing a mask or keeping distance.
I think it was quite interesting because a part of the practice, of course, would have been to be in Graz and to engage with the people. But then this was somehow, it was not possible. So there was also a question of how to make this stress of time visible. And I think, like with the timeline on the top right, you can follow then in their documents. This was between the first and the second lockdown, and how this different phases of lockdown affected the relationship of labor and space and time and work.
Another group was the British artist group, British American artist group Ultra Red. They worked with unemployed people in Graz. And I was also commissioned with, it was a sound work where they put together these listening booths, and people then could also add about this hearing experience within the exhibition.
We might think of Ultra Red as a group that engages in militant listening.
Mm-hmm.
Right, yeah, we're talking about that. And then we had two works which definitely talk about different models of temporalities than the kind of Western model that always separates out past, present, and future. So where these things totally collapse or don't exist in this way. We showed two videos of the collective Black Quantum Futurism, and Rashida Phillip writes, Black Quantum Futurism is exploring and developing modes and practices of spatio-temporal consciousness that would be more beneficial to marginalized people's survival in a high-tech world currently dominated by oppressive linear time constructs.
It's a very clear politicization of temporality.
Yes.
Yeah. And the two images are still images from the video time travel experiences.
Right. And then we really like that work because it works then very effectively also towards gentrification and to really open the art context into different, political struggles and what do we call it, to radical Black
Temporalities, yeah.
chronopolitics.
Chronopolitics,
Right. So we wanted to invite them also for a performance and for a talk, but that, again, unfortunately wasn't possible.
Sure.
And the last work is about Indigenous Temporalities, and they are addressed in an animation by Amanda Strong, based on text by Leanne Better Simpson, and it's called Biederbahn. And it's actually quite a complex film that sets up the viewer to see to get introduced to these multiplicities of Indigenous temporality. At the end of the film, we literally see how a notion of settler time is totally turned upside down to reveal, again, these multiplicities of times, the past, the present, the future don't work in that way within this Aboriginal, Indigenous temporalities. So for the next works, I think I stop sharing the screen. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about a quote from the text that I think the audience would be interested in hearing you explain a little bit about. It's a section wherein you respond to the notion of linear time that has been and is still in motion, that is designed to, quote, keep the economy healthy, and the potential for public time to fulfill the promises of public space. Can you talk about the ways in which public time and public space relate to one another, and where you see the potential for temporal and spatial reimagining? And perhaps I can read that quote really quickly, so provide some context. You say, is there an opportunity for public time to fulfill the promises of public space that have been blocked by design, by financialization, by privatization and its hybrids, by policing, by surveillance, and by the imperative of consumption? Can the right to space, the right to the city, be reimagined as the right to time? Can the right to a good life also be the right to imagine and live a different rhythm, a different time?
Right. Yeah. So that's, you can see us making that kind of emphasis onto time and temporality in relationship to space, always to think those two things through together. And if that great political project of public space, of making space public, and the possibilities that arrive from having the possibilities and necessities of public spaces, those pretty systematically been shut down in lots of ways. Particularly, we've seen over the last decade new forms of policing that have radically closed down public space, along with surveilling. We're just making this optimistic turn towards temporality is something that can be thought in relationship to the spatial as a way of opening up the politics of time, but also perhaps pulling together the potential of space itself, or public space, the potentials of public space. So essentially this comes out of our optimism that if we look at time as a form, if we look at time as a site of struggle and time as a social construct, that's been historically constructed, how can we change that? How can we, if we experience time as a material thing, then we experience it as a political thing and as something that shapes our lives, how can we start to think through how changing temporality will have political outcomes, when we'll have social and everyday outcomes that could potentially make people's lives better. I know that this is a way of thinking through the struggles of labor historically as well, but we wanted to bring that together with the struggles around space, which is not to throw away that space, of course, as a site of struggle, but just to bring that together with time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting lead into a question about publicness and art in general. So this project, and maybe I could have introduced this a bit earlier, Stephen did in the introduction, but this program is held in conjunction with an exhibition that was designed as a response to the pandemic's effect of being in the world, of being together and being in public. And we've been talking a lot about public time and public space and kind of talking around that by providing examples. But what I'd be interested to hear is your thoughts on, one, since you work as a curatorial collaborative, an artistic collaborative, a writing collaborative, and just a collaborative entity in the world of academia and art, what do you think art does? What do you think art offers in relation to the development and creation of public time? We've seen a little bit of that, or we've seen examples of that in If Time Is Still Alive, the examples of the fabrics and being on those and with those. But maybe you can talk about that transformational space of an art exhibition or a public art site.
Yeah, this is a question that for all three of us would still be very much in process, and one that we're looking to other artists to see how they're working on it, and also towards new social movements. What forms of publicness are they producing, and also how they're working in relationship to artists. But essentially, I guess we would take that kind of classic first two steps that art always has been historically strong at in taking when it comes to like social change, which is first to make is first through representation. So obviously art can represent forms of being in public. It can represent new forms of publicness. It can represent public time. We've aimed to do this a lot in particular. We've aimed with this kind of representational mode of art making of politics in a lot of projects around architecture and housing, for instance. So secondly, though, what art can do, and this is a bit what we were trying to do in the exhibition, was that it can make, it can create forms of publicness itself. So it can create forms of public time, whether that's changing the relationship and temporality of viewing, or the other way that we've thought this through is that art can make time more palpable, right? So we were thinking that in the same way that public art, if we think back to certain moments in public art, it made a public aware of spaces in a different way, not only aware of art, but also of spaces in a different way. And so we're just thinking of ways that art could make an audience or make a public aware of temporalities, to thicken time so it becomes a material, so that it becomes a site of investigation. So how art could produce new forms of temporalities and also therefore produce public time is something that we were hoping to, I guess we saw ourselves opening a conversation both for us and others, which is why we're excited to be here with you, Max, and everyone else. But that's very much how we're approaching it as a process, and how is this going to work. And it won't be a unified project. Obviously, there'll be different forms of public time and of temporalities that work within people's differentiated lives. So it's not a universal project in any way, but I would say the universal aspect of it is to politicize time itself. I think that art has a long-standing history of politicizing concepts and politicizing everyday life in a sense.
And I think it's also, I mean, around public space, we have so much discursive aspects. We have so much ideas and concepts and ideas how we can think about that. With public time, we don't really have that, or with publicness in a way. Mm-hmm. So we were also talking about this idea of space is produced, this Lefebvrean idea of the production of space, that it's always a society or active activities produce a space. So how is that? How can you produce public time or this kind of publicness? So I think it's good that we shift some of these ideas from space to time to create this field of publicness.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting. That's an interesting project to take on, to think about that through art. And one of the things I used to say when I was teaching, I would ask students to describe their experience of walking into the Manil collection here in Houston. This is a sacred space for art experience, and all of them would reflect on the way in which that space slowed down time and also created or enforced a sort of etiquette of walking slowly, quietly, arms behind your back. And so just the experience of entering a space without art on the walls even enforces this sort of different temporal interruption or reality. It formalizes that space. Public art is interesting because it's an interruption in a site that is usually a site of transition, right? It's a space like a public park where you're seeing art, or a billboard in between one place to the next, asking you to stop and look. And one thing I wanted to talk about was how, despite the multitude of social and political issues that you're researching, you're always thinking about the image politics of what's involved in or whatever the subject matter is of your current project. Could you talk, we have an audience of artists and photographers. Could you talk about the role of photography and images in relation to the ideas surrounding time, space, and publicness? And can you talk about how the pace of image production and circulation informs how we experience time, as well as publicness?
I think Sabine is just sharing the screen here.
Brilliant.
Right, maybe before we talk more in detail about the next work, which is up, actually the title is Recall.
Architecture and its publicness.
And this relates a bit what you said before, that how to get a grip onto how, for example, space and time are related and connected. And there is really a very good thought by A.L. Weisman, where he says that, for example, architecture is the slowing down of social forces. And we thought, because our work is very much starting off with architecture, which carries some meaning, and then we try through the media of photography to mediate some of the implicit thoughts we want to convey. So it's actually, I think it's related what you said before with the what's the relation between the public and the, let's say, the art spaces. I think what we always try is to dissolve a bit this kind of monolithic idea that there is something like a homogeneous public, or that the art space is a kind of autonomous space only. Mm-hmm. This is a bit just as a
so quick background. That work was done. It was a huge wallpaper installation at the Vancouver Art Gallery, which is located in an old courthouse, and will be moved to a new fancy signature building by Herzog de Meuron. So we chose three buildings which all relate to publicness. On one hand, the former post office on the left, which is now turned into a totally incredible, fancy condo high-rise building. So the original says, but then on top is a condo. Then a very famous housing project from the 50s, which was just demolished. And then in the middle here, and then the court laws of Vancouver, which is also a very, it has the court buildings in it. What is it called?
It's the law building.
Provincial law courts, right? Government offices, and it's also in transition. So just a combination of these three different buildings, which you really have to think of how do they relate architecturally or in terms of what their public function is. And so to bring those together as a marker in the time when all of these things are totally in transition, basically meaning that these public buildings get privatized, demolished, yeah. And also we have worked lots with wallpaper, and we always like the idea that it's not only representing a space, but actually producing a new space, how and how you move through, and what these images do with an existing building.
Right, and if we go, maybe, can you go back one more? And there's also, in terms of how to start off with a kind of regular size database, data of the image. With this rasterization, you really can you can blow up the images in different sizes. But also with the type of rasterization, with the scale of the banded dots, you can, for example, you can make the chosen images looking like a photograph where you want to get into distance and you want to see details. But blowing up the dots, for example, it's you can perceive the image from a distance. So we did this kind of, where all the garbage comes down, this kind of explosive situation you can see from the far distance, but then the making of the image leads you that you go closer and you see the details in the other images. So that's quite interesting in terms of how the image also is positioning us as viewers.
Mm-hmm.
It's producing a space, but it's also positioning us.
And suggesting or proposing a way for the viewers when they walk out of the exhibition space to look at the world, right?
Yeah.
I think
This is actually,
and an even more proposition for the viewer is this more recent work, which we did last year in New York, where we worked, it's called Park Avenue Plaza, Performing Publicness. And we produced, again, those beautiful jacquard textiles, but very photographically. And we like this jacquard so much because it seems like more photographic than anything else, because it has the positive and the negative embedded in one material. And quick to that was the Austrian Cultural Forum, and very close to there, and that's a very unique New York phenomena. There's a so-called POPs, which stands for privately owned public spaces, which was invented in the 60s in terms of zoning laws that corporations could get more floors built if they provide the ground floor as a public space. So there's all this really, it's never a clear distinction what is private, what is public anymore. So those POPs are a unique thing. So we have these two curtains from one of these POPs, Park Avenue Plaza. And then we have an instruction for the audience to think of what publicness is, but also to imagine wrap themselves in one of the fabrics. But then we ask them to leave the exhibition space, walk just a few minutes to that public space and look very closely what they see, and then come back. So it's, of course, the reference to kind of conceptual art and all of these scores and instructions. And then kind of rethink what the photograph they have seen before, how that can be seen different. So it's always also about this idea that you show something which you usually don't see, or you need to see different after experience a work.
And I'll just point out that that public-private space it's where the BlackRock Investment Group has one of their headquarters, and as an investment corporation, they're very much invested in kind of the annihilation of space and time. So they're buying a lot of real estate, a lot of people's pensions, which is another form of time in a sense, are embedded into the funds that they manage. So it's not only looking at that relationship between public-private space in New York, but looking at how how public-private space and real estate became such a commodity and such an investment. And I guess within a temporal frame, I would say the way that there's always a temporal speculation on real estate or on housing. How much is it going to be worth in the future? So just that very domestic sense of a house shifting to becoming a commodity, and then how that commodity is supposed to expand over time. So in a sense, there's a surplus value will be extracted from a home over time. This was very much the case in Vancouver during the COVID situation, where some areas saw a 27% increase in housing costs over the course of the shutdown, as people moved farther away from the city because they didn't have to commute. So that relationship between public-private space, real estate, and temporality all kind of come together in this one in a way that we hadn't had a chance to think through fully. But I think in this moment, you can see it coalescing in that sense.
Right. But I think we take a lot of time, so I think we're going to skip the militant image, right?
Yeah, I think that's that we definitely want to be conscious of time. So I think, yeah, maybe we can move forward with the question about what you're working on now. Is that okay?
Absolutely, yeah. This was an exhibition we curated about the notion of the militant image, which we still kind of work on it, what that could mean. Harun Farouqi's work and Emily Chassier's work. And yeah, this is one larger project Helmut and I work on right now, Performing Spaces of Radical Pedagogies. And it looks at modernist campus architecture and the history of pedagogy, of radical pedagogy, and then the possibility of how to use this architecture, or how to work on radical pedagogies now, which in the case of Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, we work on Indigenous pedagogies. So we founded a small working group with Indigenous folks, and because we were invited for a big exhibition in Berlin at the House of World Cultures. And so we called ourselves guests and hosts, and we made a series of photographs where we put the architecture upside down, but always have one element which looks like it's right. So a young Indigenous student was kind of also, we wanted to have a bit of an ironic approach. She kind of holds up the whole university. And the upside down was also a reference to when you have a flag and you put it upside down, it means total urgency and total crisis. So that is also used in protests quite a bit. So we used that upside down as a means to.
So to have the Canadian flag upside down at a I don't know more gathering in Canada shows that the colonial state in crisis. Right.
So this was how it was installed in Berlin. So this was one of our recent things, architecture and radical pedagogy and how to perform. And I don't know, maybe that's also somebody sees the reference to Valley Export's work, how bodies relate to female bodies, to male space. So there were lots of like things around that, but I'm not going into detail now. Okay.
And then I'm curious to ask, I know that there was a video produced in conjunction with the exhibition. Is that film online? Is there a way to view that? Or was that a limited time kind of a thing?
That is another exhibition in Lethbridge right now. It's not online yet, but we were talking about it, putting it online.
Okay.
So thanks for the reminder. That's what because actually we would like to make it accessible. Right. Right.
The public seminar video.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. Hey, go ahead, Max. If you
No, it's all you. The floor is yours.
Yes, the other thing we're working on, that we were just our first initial post-COVID travel was to Dusseldorf, where we're working on a project called Place Internationale, which looks to both kind of in a sense, I won't say commemorate, but to extend and expand the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune. And the work that we're doing there is to make a link between the Paris Commune and with the communes that were set up in Venezuela from the early 2000s through for a couple of decades there. We had spent some time in Venezuela and done work with communities, self-organized communities there. And we're going to make a link to the area in Dusseldorf where the show is, which is Kiefernstrasse, which is a small semi-autonomous, I would say, zone of Dusseldorf that started out with squattings in the late 1980s, and then they got control of buildings and work with the city in how much agency they can have in the kind of semi-autonomous zone. So we're looking at notions of the commune and notions of dual power as well, which is something we thought through in Venezuela. So just trying to make, I guess I would say, a spatial and temporal link between three different sites and moments of the possibility of living together through communal means.
Mm-hmm.
But then also this photo quickly, the commune was like an incredible moment in terms of photography. In terms of, yeah, I don't go into that, but this is from 1871 when the artists mostly demolished and toppled the colonial statue. And all the people who work and move are, of course, these blurry ghosts because of the technique, photographic technique at that time. So there's, we might work something on that too, on the kind of photographic blurs and how people move and what you see and what you can't see.
Thank you for your generosity in speaking with me today. I want to make sure that the audience has a chance to ask any questions. If you're watching on YouTube or on Zoom, you could submit your comments in the chat and we will field them directly to Urban Subjects. And while we're waiting on questions, I thought I would ask for a bit of clarification because we've been talking about some ideas and terminology that are complex in nature. Could you explain exactly what is the idea of public time? I think it's easy to imagine what public space is, even if for us in the US, public space is quite limited in the true sense of the word. But maybe you can kind of track back to this question about public time.
Yeah, so I think that it's going to be one of these semi-slippery answers in a sense that because public time won't be a uniform time, so it's not like an existing time that you can step into and experience in the way that we might more statically think of public space. But it would be a reimagining of one's everyday life in a way that would allow time for publicness. Now, that's not going to be the same in everyone's lives because different shift works and different access to time, but it would also be a way of thinking through the way that public spaces allow us to think through the idea of the right to the city, the right to public space, the right to public time is a way to focus a kind of temporal politics in a sense.
And I think what we also know from space that it's constantly, it's never fixed, it's never done. It always will be produced. So there's constant struggle around it, right? It's never this fixed entity of something. So that's the same for public time.
So I'd be tempted to also say like, well, public time could be something as simple as recognizing that not everyone has the same access to vote because of the time restrictions rather than space restrictions. So if you think of the ways that public space is necessary for democracy, public time is also necessary for democracy, both for debate, but for voting. So what if we thought of access to voting as also a temporal question as well?
I was wondering if you'd if you were beginning to formulate a response to the even more complex temporal experiences we're having now with opening then closing, and these kinds of things. Has that begun to filter into your practice yet, or your thinking at least?
Certainly filtered into our everyday lives and our job lives. As the university in Vancouver is moving to be fully open. Yeah, so in terms of just how we've been trying to think it through, it would be part of that unevenness of the temporal experience. But yeah, and again, like we tend to think that these things are going to affect everybody the same, but of course they don't. So there's a kind of, I think there's a kind of right to access to time and differentiated time that might come into being in a sense.
Yeah, there's a funny something that I heard that kind of described that the confusing nature of this time really well was we have to close because we're open. We have to open because we've been closed. We need to stay closed because we've been closed. And if we stay closed, we can open. But once we open, we probably need to close. And that's just kind of the confusing atmosphere that we're kind of experiencing. We have a question or a comment from Maria del Carmen, who's asking, could we have the reference for that amazing image of the falling statue we just saw? This is that from the Paris Commune, I believe.
It's a photo from the May 16th, 1871, André Adolphe Eugene Disdéry.
Disdéry, I guess.
Disdéry, right. I have this on the other computer. I don't know how I find that now. It is, it's really interesting because the toppling of the statue at the Place Vendôme. So if somebody looks for Place Vendôme is on 16th May, it was toppled and it was very much also artists being part of it. Gustave Courbet was, how do you say, instrumental to that act. But also it was such an interesting moment because it was the first time when people were posing also in front of in this photo, they all move around, but they're also posing. And it was the first time that photos of the people who posed were then used to actually kill them all and arrest them and kill them. So photograph as evidence that they have done it. So it has such an incredible history of what you can't see, what you want to reveal, and what the mask, how that is then later becomes such an important thing in protests, for example.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So André Disdéry, and it's Place Vendôme, May 16th, 1871. And there's a whole series. We did one photo collage for a magazine. You can't see. Oh,
that was me. Sorry about that.
Okay, great.
Okay, I don't know if we have any additional questions, but we're running close to time. And I just really want to say thank you all again for joining us today. Sabine, Jeff, Helmut, it's been a thrilling couple of months to be in conversation with you. And I'm so thrilled to be able to share your work and your ideas with FotoFest audience. It means a lot to me, and I'm sure a lot of people are walking away very inspired by this project and talk. So thank you again for taking time to speak about your work, to talk about the ideas with us, and to share this space and time with us today. And this program will be archived on our YouTube channel. So if folks are in the audience and they're interested in sharing urban subjects work, please send them the link to this so that we can continue this dialogue together.
It'll also be on FotoFest webpage, so you can find it there as well. Thanks for an inspiring conversation, and until another time.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Matt, too. It was great.
Thanks, everybody. Have a nice evening in Houston.
To the next time.
To the next time. Hopefully soon. You never know.
Yes, we hope so.
Yeah.
All right.
In the meantime, it got dark here. It was totally bright.
Yeah, now we're sitting a bit in the dark.
Yeah, right.
Well, cheers to a relaxing evening, and thank you again to our audience. Thank you, Stephen, for introductions and for the additional questions. And Urban Subjects, I'll talk to you soon.
Yes, looking forward to it. Thanks,
Hey,
people. Bye.
Bye.